On April 1970, the third manned flight of NASA's Apollo program was launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida. The mission, which was known as Apollo 13, was intended to be the third moon landing after Apollo 11 and 12, but 2 days into the flight, an explosion in the service module crippled the spacecraft, forcing the crew to abandon their plans and fight for their very survival. Here's the story of Apollo 13, the most dangerous journey of its time. After 2 days in space, the astronauts were almost at their halfway point to the moon. Their trajectory would take them around the far side of the moon before returning to Earth. But this is where things would go wrong. On April, at 63 seconds past 1500 UTC, or 11:09 a.m. Eastern Time, a sudden bang echoed through the command module. An alarm sounded, and the cabin lights flashed red. Commander Allwarden had just checked out of the command module to prepare for extravehicular activity. And when he returned, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A cloud of white vapor filled the air, and a hissing sound could be heard escaping from somewhere in the ship. Upon further inspection, it was discovered that the source of the problem was an oxygen tank in the service module, the part of the spacecraft that supported the command module. The explosion had blown a hole clean through the side of the tank, but what caused the explosion? As the astronauts worked to solve this problem, telemetry data was being collected by NASA and sent back to the Mission Control Center. It showed that the temperature of the oxygen tank had risen dramatically before the explosion. This indicated that there had been a short circuit somewhere in the wiring harness that fed the oxygen tank. The wiring harness had become overheated, causing the pressurized oxygen tank to rupture, which is why the explosion was so powerful. One of the 4 helium pressurizing tanks used to pressurize the fuel cells, which generated electricity for the spacecraft, had also been damaged. Electrical power was lost, and the service module, which contained all of the spacecraft's propulsion systems, life support, and thermal control, was now useless. They were basically a drifting hunk of space junk at this point. The astronauts did their best to make repairs, while NASA attempted to figure out what to do next. But the truth is that there wasn't much they could do. With one of the helium tanks ruptured and the other 3 critically damaged, there was no way to restart the fuel cells. The commander, Jim Lovell, tried to contact Houston to discuss their options, but communications were still in blackout period, meaning that the astronauts couldn't hear what was being said. This was done to protect the astronauts from any potentially harmful information during critical periods of the mission. Once communication was restored, Lovell reported that their supply of oxygen would last for about 48 hours and that they would need to conserve water, electrical power, and fuel. For the next few days, the astronauts performed experiments to try and find a way to restart the fuel cells. They tried switching the main breaker, which controlled the power to the fuel cells, on and off again, hoping that it would reset whatever had caused the short circuit. They tried purging the oxygen tank to remove any excess heat, but nothing worked. On April, NASA put together a plan to rescue the astronauts. But it was a risky move that would push the technology and the astronauts to the limit. They would use the Lunar module, which was supposed to be used for moon landings, to rescue the stranded astronauts. Normally, only one person would ride the Lunar module to the surface of the moon and then rendezvous with the rest of the crew back in the command module. But in this case, all 3 astronauts would have to fit inside the cramped Lunar module. And because there was no service module to provide power, they would have to land in Lunar module using batteries alone. If everything went according to plan, the Lunar module would be able to dock with the command module, and the astronauts could transfer over. But if anything went wrong, the astronauts would have to stay in the Lunar module until the next Apollo mission came along, which was scheduled to launch in less than a month. At that point, NASA was pretty sure that the astronauts wouldn't survive the trip, so they offered the crew a choice. If they wanted to end their mission early, NASA would fire the engines of the Lunar module, deorbiting the spacecraft and allowing the astronauts to burn up in the atmosphere. Or they could stay in the Lunar module until the next mission arrived. This would be extremely dangerous since the astronauts would have to survive on limited supplies for almost a month while enduring micrometeoroid impacts and radiation. But against all odds, the astronauts decided to stay alive. The Lunar module was undocked from the command module and began its descent toward the moon. Just before it reached the surface, the astronauts fired the engines to put the craft into lunar orbit. Once in orbit, the astronauts got to work preparing the lunar module for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. They removed the equipment that they didn't need, jettisoned the lunar module ascent stage, and prepared themselves for the long journey home. Over the next several days, the astronauts performed experiments to try and restore power to the command module. But nothing worked. After running out of spare parts, they had no choice but to remain in the lunar module. Meanwhile, NASA was working feverishly to come up with a solution. Every day that the astronauts spent in the lunar module without power took away precious water and food supplies. NASA needed to get them home quickly. Then, after days of working around the clock, a solution finally presented itself. Flight controllers figured out a way to power the command module remotely from the lunar module. If they could bring the two ships close enough together, they could transmit power from the lunar module to the command module, essentially using the lunar module as a battery. This would give the astronauts enough power to run their life support systems and hopefully get them home safely. But there was a big problem. To make this work, the ships would have to be brought within 30 meters of each other. And the lunar module could only be maneuvered while it was powered on. This meant that NASA would have to bring the two ships together in complete darkness. If even the tiniest of errors occurred, the mission could be over in a matter of seconds. The plan was approved and NASA began its slow and delicate dance to bring the two ships together. As the lunar module began its approach, a voice crackled over the radio. "Okay, guys, here's the deal. If you can hear me, turn your lights on." The astronauts didn't hesitate. They flipped the switch, and the dark void of space was suddenly filled with light as the command module's interior was illuminated. The two ships were now just meters apart, but the risks were far from over. As the ships approached each other, alarms began to blare. The computers were detecting a collision course. "Houston, we have a problem," said astronaut Jack Schweighardt over the radio. "We're on a collision course." The ground team worked quickly to correct the ship's trajectory, guiding the lunar module away from the command module just in time to avoid a catastrophic collision, but the danger wasn't over yet. Now that the ships were close enough together, NASA began transmitting power from the lunar module to the command module. The astronauts watched anxiously as the lights flickered back to life. The power was restored, and the command module was once again a viable spacecraft. But the astronauts couldn't celebrate yet. They had to get home. The lunar module had almost no fuel left, and it was slowly losing altitude. The astronauts had to leave immediately. As the lunar module undocked from the command module, a single tear rolled down astronaut Fred Hayes' face. He knew that this might be the last time he ever saw his crewmates. The lunar module began its descent toward the Earth's atmosphere. It hit the upper atmosphere at a blistering speed of 175,000 kilometers per hour. But it was slowly losing altitude. The astronauts knew that if they could just reach the atmosphere, they would be safe. But as the lunar module approached the surface, the computer began to alarm. The ship was too low, and it was rapidly descending. There wasn't enough atmosphere to slow the ship down. But just as the astronauts braced for impact, the ship suddenly shot upward. The lunar module had bottomed out and was now on a suborbital trajectory. It would fly straight back out into space. But the astronauts had other plans. Using the small amount of fuel that remained, they fired the engines and put the lunar module into a stable orbit. The ship was now safe, but it was just a drifting hunk of space junk with 3 astronauts inside. The crew began to ration their remaining water and food and settled in for the long haul. Meanwhile, NASA worked to develop a rescue plan. They knew that the astronauts wouldn't survive more than a few weeks without water or food. And the next Apollo mission was still months away. But NASA wasn't going to let the astronauts die. They developed a plan to use the Apollo 14 spacecraft to rescue the astronauts. But there was a big problem. Apollo 14 was scheduled to launch in just 2 weeks. NASA didn't have time to make the necessary modifications to rescue the crew. So NASA made a bold move. They canceled the Apollo 14 mission and reassigned the crew to Apollo 15. The new crew would now have to wait until August to fly. But the astronauts aboard the lunar module didn't know that. They were beginning to run low on supplies, and they were starting to panic. Just when things looked their darkest, the Apollo 15 crew arrived to make the rescue. After 141 hours in space, the astronauts were finally brought back to Earth. They landed in the Pacific Ocean on April and were immediately pulled from the water by waiting ships. The astronauts had survived. Apollo 13 remains one of the most incredible stories of human achievement. The astronauts displayed incredible courage and determination as they fought to survive. The story has been told and retold countless times in books, movies, and documentaries. And it continues to inspire people around the world today.